Well, listeners, you've got me, Aaron Hedge, today, and I'm here again with Cassy Benefield, who is our first three-peat guest on the show. I do a lot of reporting with Cassy at Range Media, and you might remember a few weeks back, Val and I had talked about an article that Cassy and I wrote together about the Family Policy Institute of Washington advocating for a couple of pieces of, or a couple of ballot initiatives that were aimed at banning trans girls from girl sports in schools in Washington, and also giving parents the right to access the medical records of their kids, meaning that like if a younger person was socially transitioning and didn't want to let their parents know, the parents would have a right to that information. Well, FPIW is, and we'll talk about what that organization is in broader terms today, but Cassy and I had a follow-up article that published last week. Was it last week? I'm losing track of time.
Yes, it was.
It was last week. And it's about a series of articles that are being published on the website of FPIW that are essentially arguing that, the society should like the American society should be centered around like Christianity, and essentially, and arguing that the United States should like dramatically curtail immigration from countries that are not majority white, establishing English as the official language, and basically arguing for re-Christianizing of the United States. Cassy, welcome. Thanks for joining me again. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, yeah, so we kind of set the table a little bit for what FPIW is, but and Cassy and I worked on these stories together, but Cassy was the one who like kind of proposed them to me, and that we co-report them. Can you talk to me? And this goes back to issues that we've talked about on the radio before. Can you remind us like kind of how you got turned on to these articles? It was at a couple of Charlie Kirk memorials that we had reported on together for your publication, Fāvs News.
Right, and I think the thread that I kept pulling was the thread of Brian Noble. I had, been covering him for Fāvs as he was the lead pastor of Valley Assembly, and he was running for Spokane County Commissioner, and he had a pretty robust campaign and going on. And I had seen his sign while driving, and I remembered interviewing him before that as the executive director, CEO, and president. I'm not sure what titles off the top of my head at the moment, of Peacemaker Ministries. And so I had interviewed him for that during COVID. And so he had popped up on a drive, and I thought, oh, he's a pastor. He's running for a political position. I'm a reporter for a religion news website. I need to report this story. And so things went from there. And he, as a pastor, had Charlie Kirk at his church, hosted him at his church. And I had started getting familiar with Charlie Kirk at that time and Christian nationalism, and that word had started kind of coming into the foray. And and so Brian Noble happened to be at the Charlie Kirk memorial that we kind of co-covered. I covered one event, and you covered the other one, that like a few days later, and we wrote an article on that together. And then Brian Noble had reached out to us, and I thought, and it seemed like he would be open to an interview, and so we got to sit down and interview him. And the rest is history. And now he's the president and CEO of Family Policy Institute of Washington. And so it was just an incredible opportunity.
He started texting you when that article about the Charlie Kirk vigils published. Can you tell me what he texted you?
Oh man, I can't remember. He said he had heard the podcast. And he had a question. He heard the question in my voice about something about loving your neighbors, and it just seemed like, because I don't remember how I got caught up reading. I think I was reading the articles from Family Policy Institute of Washington, and it seemed like, well, it didn't seem like those articles felt loving your neighborly. Loving your neighborly.
You had I think it really struck you that like one of the things that Brian Noble tries to he's advocating for policies at the state level that or his organization is that kind of try to enshrine Christian values in the policy system, and
but as a certain interpretation of them.
Yeah, and it seems a lot like Christian nationalism, and there's a lot of lines that you have to like kind of cover, and he does not identify as a Christian nationalist. He really bristles when somebody suggests that he is one, and he has a specific definition of it.
And we are really careful to make sure that's known in our articles.
Yeah. Basically, the idea is that he believes that Christians are going to be raptured up to heaven before Christ comes back to earth in the second coming, and that differentiates him from from his definition of Christian nationalists who believe that Christ is going to come back before the rapture and establish a 1,000-year reign on the earth, and they're basically like tilling the ground for a good environment for Christ to. Right. They're basically trying to build Christ's kingdom as he would have it before he comes back.
And if you want the technical term, it's all millennialism, and he's a premillennialist.
Yes.
Okay.
But you were struck by this language that was that he used on stage. That he's trying to create this policy environment that's not this like focus. It's like very heavily influenced by Christianity. At a rally for a man who. Made some pretty Charlie Kirk, who was he was an influencer who was tragically assassinated at the end of the summer this year. But he held these public events where he would say things like and he had a podcast where he would advocate for just like essentially ending immigration into the United States from countries that aren't white. He also had some, frankly, pretty sexist views. He believed that women should prioritize motherhood, and that they, he didn't say that they couldn't serve in like public office, but that they belonged in the home, and that was like their primary purpose in life. And it was, I think it struck you that like at this service that was memorializing Kirk, Brian Noble was saying, we're trying to create a Christian society so that we can love our neighbor. And that's kind of what got us into the...
Well, yeah, it's very hard to nail Brian down. On one hand, I'm super impressed with how he really tries to focus, like I am a Christian, and so he tries to focus Christians on that our hope is not in government. Yay, that's 1,000%. I agree with that. And yet he doesn't want to say I'm trying to legislate laws that make people Christian, but he wants to legislate laws that are moral to save people from the wrath of God. And
moral according to like a pretty narrow interpretation of Christianity.
Yes, and then and to save them from God's wrath, but that's their choice. So it's just all these kind of weird. I think he's just working out his own understanding of what he believes. Frankly, he's still working through it.
Well, and he did talk to us about having evolved as a Christian, but he.
True.
He spent an hour and a half with us in a coffee shop in Spokane Valley, and he was very generous with his time, and he was kind and cordial.
He spent time writing us papers about his beliefs, which is incredible. So it was fabulous.
But you still couldn't shake this like dissonance over the idea that like loving your neighbor like was a line of rhetoric at a Charlie Kirk rally, and so you started poking around on FPIW's website, and you discovered that. And even,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, because Charlie Kirk, they even in an article, there's a quote from Kirk from a Twitter quote that said, "Immigration without assimilation is invasion." And so now we have to define, well, what do they mean by assimilation? And then you read this article, and they have a very narrow view of what assimilation means. And so it's just like, goodness, huh?
Well, and these articles are written by a man named Dr. Travis Pardo, and he's a research associate, I think,
fellow.
I think they call him a fellow at FPIW. He's basically kind of like their flagship thinker who like writes these pieces. And to be clear, like Noble has written a lot of pieces as well on their website, but Travis has been with them, I think, since 2023, 2024.
Yeah, about the same time amount as Noble, actually.
Okay, and so and there's like the articles that we're talking about are like they're kind of like the most recent articles and there's two series of articles. One of them, the first one, is about American identity and Christianity and immigration, and yeah, I guess. Can you just tell me like what your perception of those articles is, and like kind of like what you found and what your experience reading them was? I've read them, but you've done like really deep dives into them.
Well, I am, there is a sense of bias, I will say, because this is a subject that I am really passionate about, which is Christian nationalism and how Christians should live out their Christianity in the civil square or in civil religion. And so I've been working through this for like years. And
from like a personal perspective. Yeah, your personal views on it. Yeah.
And because I had a pastor who was a little cuckoo, and so I've had to do a lot of detangling of it. And when I looked at these articles, should I just be honest?
Yeah.
So I honestly felt like it was a very soft way of opening the door for conversation of white supremacy. And I felt gut punched, frankly. And I didn't mention that in the articles because that was a complete feeling of mine. And I didn't want that to come across. I just wanted to explore, take a deep dive, and I'm so grateful to write this article with you because you come from a totally different perspective. And it just was really interesting to listen to people that were experts in the field with like Muslim hate, Islamophobia, and Cornell Clayton at WSU, who leads the Tom Foley Institute there, which is about lots of civic square work, and how it's service oriented, and that's Brian's heart. I know it is as well, and it just struck me as like this is about dividing really colored people from uncolored, white people, or that's just how I felt.
Well, and I think it might be helpful to like talk about specifically what's in these articles, and we've got the first
point.
series is essentially it's titled "Who Are We? Mass Immigration's Detrimental Impact." And then there's a hyphen, and it says "Renewing American Identity," and that's part one. And then so it's about American identity, and it's very concerned with mass immigration.
And they were very specific that the country started out immigrating from European countries first, and then they opened the door to the other countries. And that's when the mass immigration started. But then I'm thinking to myself, but what about the wars and the refugees and all of the poverty? I mean, there was just so many questions, but there was no nuance there in that. It was just like, oh, we used to do it from European countries, and now look at us, and now look at our nation.
The second piece is titled "Protecting the English Language," and it asserts that we need to establish English as the official language, A, of Washington, and B, as the United States. The third part is titled "Revival for a Christian Nation." Like, the United States and Washington need to be, if not like, they wouldn't say like run as like a theocracy, like essentially by Christians for Christians, where they would like try to like force other people to become Christians, but it would be run according to Christian values. So as long as you could be in positions of influence and not from a Christian community, but your values are Christian. They have to be Christian.
It would be like overtly Christian culture, but yet
Yes.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the fourth part is titled "Honoring Our British Heritage, Renewing American Identity." And so
I think that one was the weirdest one for me.
So it's
I don't think
it has to be English.
I had never actually heard of that before as a Christian like motto, or I had never heard of that before.
So it has to, like, we have to speak English, we have to be Christian. Maybe not on an individual level, but as a society, we have to be Christian, and we have to honor our British heritage, which is like the part where they talk about, like just like respecting British values. And one of the really interesting like splits for me in these pieces, they're very explicit that people from non-majority white countries don't want to assimilate, and that they're changing our culture. And that's like that. I think that's where you clocked the idea of like, and they would not characterize this as like a white supremacist idea, but
definitely
but
not. Definitely
there's
not.
definitely some
Feels.
I wouldn't even call them dog whistles, but just kind of like overtly like you're supposed to be white, you're supposed to be Christian, you're supposed to honor your British heritage, and that's very
good.
Yeah. It seems like it wants to exclude a large portion of the American community,
and it does make people. I mean, it seems like it wants to make people feel like second-class citizens, and that to me is the opposite of loving your neighbor.
They started publishing. So that's the first series. They've started publishing this new series called "The Rise of Islam: Its Power in Washington State," and they've only published the first part of it. But basically, it kind of it contains a lot of statistics that are from various sources, and there's kind of wildly different numbers. And I want to dive into some of those later. But basically, what it says is that like there are organizations in Washington that want to turn Washington Islamic, which is kind of it's interesting considering the fact that they want to turn Washington Christian, and they have a justification for this, and we'll probably talk about that as well. But we interviewed, and I was only there for like part of this interview. We interviewed. I can't remember his first name.
Terry.
Terry Kylo. He's a Lutheran reverend, right?
Pastor. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you? and you had him read this piece on Islam, and he does a lot of work with
Yes.
Islamic communities and organizations to try to like build common ground with those organizations. Can you talk about kind of like how he responded to this rhetoric and why he thinks it's dangerous?
He was almost like, yeah, this is it was very pat to him in the sense that it was the same old, you know, for him, looking at the the language and the wide generalizations and fear-based rhetoric and the things of that nature, and how it created, he kept saying it created a kind of a plumb line, I'm not saying it right, but kind of an atmosphere of excuse for people to see others is Muslims as enemies. And so as soon as you start building that kind of culture and laying that foundation, it doesn't matter if you're Christian or, you know, you love Jesus, or I just don't even know how to say it. You start justifying that these people are not Christian, they don't love God, they're evil, and you start opening the door to violence because you start to justify your own fear and fear of the other, and that's basically how he had seen it. And he spent a good amount of time with us, really explaining that in his years of experience working in this field, frankly, and with friendships that he's had over the years with people.
He said it's an attempt to weaponize people's desire to protect themselves, their own love of their own community, with slander about another group. And I remember
that's really, yeah, it's so well said.
I was getting off the phone at this point, but I wish that I had been able to stick around, but I had to be in a different interview. But he was talking about how this is like very similar rhetoric to what the Nazis used in World War II about Jewish communities. You know, they're other, they're antithetical to our values, and he sees that as like, you know, creating fertile ground for violence, and he cited specific instances of violence against Muslim communities. I think he was specifically referenced the killing of a couple men in Portland who were trying to defend a woman who was wearing a hijab from a man who was threatening the woman with a knife. So he kind of sees it as being like inherently violent rhetoric, even if the people who are propagating it don't see it that way. And of course, we can't say enough that Brian Noble and Travis Pardo don't believe this is violent rhetoric.
Correct. They don't see it that way.
We reached out to Travis, and what was his response to these criticisms?
Yeah, he was so gracious. He said that he was basically priming up what his next piece was going to be, and he had a high view of humanity, including people who believe differently, like people who are Muslim, and that he just, because they all have the image of God, and that wasn't the issue. It was the issue was the more like the philosophy. And I think sorry, I don't want to say I think, but so he was talking about the idea rather than the people. So what the fear for, I'm just going to be generalizing here, but the fear is the idea of Islam taking over. And that, going back to Reverend Kylo, he was saying that is, so when you hear the term Sharia law, that is actually a dog whistle, that actually made me stop. I don't want to use that anymore. But you say it is Islamic religious law, is Sharia, but it's meant for everybody interprets it on their own, how they want to live out their own religious commitments to Allah. And so that's what Sharia is. And now some countries,
he said that it translates to the way. It's the way you live as a Muslim, and
it's did you get the impression that it was a personal decision?
Yeah. And I think it's very similar to the way that individual Christians interpret like Noahide law. It's like you live according to a code, and it's very individual. It's not, you're not trying to impose it on the rest of society.
And Jesus himself is called the way. Mm. So that I think he made that connection too. So it's like, so when the fear goes around the idea of Sharia and thinking that it's going to take over, and you say Sharia law, the people who are using it for fear are manipulating it into something it's not, basically. And Travis, but that is what Travis was saying, that is what he is exploring in his pieces, not the people, but the idea behind that, the faith of Islam, specific, that particular faith.
Because
just the way it's probably because of the way it's seen in different cultures and countries, which can be extreme.
Yeah, I mean this version of Christianity, and you hear it in a lot of places. We'll talk about specifically some of those places later. And one of my, I don't have notes on this right now, but I pay a lot of attention to Pastor Matt Shea of On Fire Ministries. He says the exact same thing. Like, Islam is a totalitarian ideology, and he says that it isn't a religion, and that it wants to take over the world. At the same time that Shea gives sermons where he talks about how if Christians were living properly, they would take over the world within a very specific amount of time, and he wants the United States to be run by Christians and for Christians, and it's just that dissonance doesn't really seem to occur to them, which is really interesting to me. I do want to talk about this picture that the premise, right, which is like Islam is taking over Washington State, and there's a lot of numbers in Travis's piece on like what he calls the rise of Islam. He says there's 100,000 Muslims in Washington State, that it has a political arm called CARE Washington, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations, and that's actually a national organization. It has state chapters, and it says that there are 79 mosques or Islamic centers in 36 cities. I Googled these same numbers for Christians in Washington State. And the 100,000 number is it's a pretty generous figure. He got that number from Representative Salahuddin in the Washington legislature, who did an event where he kind of cited that. It's hard to track down kind of where that number came from. The World Population Review says, and I don't know what source is the most official or what their methodologies are. The World Population Review says that there are about 27,000 Muslims in Washington State. Oh. And so, but if you go with the bigger figure, 100,000 is about 1.25% of the population, whereas Christians comprise about 51% of the Washington population. Okay. And we're a pretty secular state. There are fewer Christians in Washington than there are in the United States as a whole, as a percentage of the population. If you look at national numbers, there are about 5 million Muslims in the United States, according to some sources that Pardo drug up. And that's less than 1% of the population, whereas about 60% of Americans identify as Christians. So it does, I don't know, to me, it seems like it's making sort of a mountain out of a molehill.
Well, and I will say, yes, I agree. And what you are saying matches, and I'm so glad you put that in the article, because that I forgot, because I had statistics from Hannah Tabor from Pew Research they had this huge 2023 to 2024 religious landscape study. And she gave me the numbers. She said there's 2% of adults in Washington identify as Muslim. And across the United States, there's 1% that identify as Muslim. And a majority of United States immigrants, 58% are Christian. And about a quarter of foreign-born adults are unaffiliated. 14% belong to other religions. So there's a lot of statistics that really aren't in his favor, but there is one statistic in his favor in the sense of like this really long-term possibility, which is Christianity is decreasing.
Yes.
So that is, but he didn't mention that, I don't think, but that is a statistic in as far as an argument, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen or it's going to affect anything. I mean, it's just a probability, I guess.
I looked at some charts that were put out by the Pew Research Center. So in 2007, 79% of Americans identified as Christian. And last year, 62% identify as Christian.
Correct.
In 2007, well, if you look at all other religions combined, in 2007, they represented about, I'm trying to read this statistic, about 5% of Americans identified with another religion. Right. And I think Islam is less than 1%. And then and now about 7% of other religions identify as belonging to another religion. The really marked increase is among the religiously unaffiliated, and this is there's a lot of study around this phenomenon called the rise of the nuns.
Correct.
Just like people who,
and it's not N-U-N.
Yeah, they're not Catholics. It's N-O-N-E, the nuns, meaning like I don't subscribe to any religion. And so if there's a threat to Christianity, and yes. The chart is pretty striking. Yes. There's a down line, which is Christianity, and there's an up line, which is the nuns. That would represent the real threat. Like people are leaving Christianity, and
all faith.
It doesn't mean that they're no longer religious or spiritual. Correct. It just means that they don't identify with the version of Christianity that they may have identified with in 2007. So that was a really interesting and revealing number to me. It's just like you might be, if you're threatened by the fall or by the erosion of Christianity in this country, it looks like you might be looking at the wrong culprit.
Right.
So that was like, and I think that kind of brings up a topic that I wanted to talk about, dealing with like the scholarship.
Yes.
In these pieces. I mean, Travis Pardo is a research fellow. He has a PhD in religion from Baylor University in Texas. And
it's a church, he said it was church-state relations, something like that.
That's what he said in his email, right?
Right.
The first quote in the first piece on Islam is from Robert Spencer, who founded Jihad Watch. And I have to pull up the information about Robert Spencer, but he's kind of a big deal. He's an overtly Islamophobic person. He is banned from the UK. He was banned, I think, in the 2010s. He was going to go speak there at a rally, and then secretary of, I can't remember the department she was secretary of, but she later became the prime minister, Theresa May, said that he shouldn't enter the country because basically, like, we don't want your we don't want your rhetoric in our country, because he very much he goes a lot farther than Pardo does, but he says that Islam is a totalitarian ideology. He calls it an ideology, and he says it's inherently violent, and obviously we know from Reverend Kylo that that's not true. He's actually embedded in those communities. He understands Islam from a much like closer perspective, but so Robert Spencer, not to be confused with the Nazi influencer Richard Spencer, but very similar like right-wing views. So that's the first quote that we get in.
So there's a fellow that I interviewed for the article or got some background from, and he actually does intelligence. He did intelligence work for the U.S. military. His name is Paul Miller, and he wrote a book about, actually he, in it has a chapter on, we forgot to mention this, the person that Travis Pardo studied, which is Samuel
Huntington.
Samuel Huntington, and that's who he uses for the pillars of American identity. And so, like the intellectual arguments for keeping a cultural identity, there are sound, even though he didn't agree with them, Paul Miller, that there are sound intellectual arguments for this kind of idea of American cultural identity. But it just seems like for if I was the intellectual writing something like this, I would try to find somebody that wasn't like, is it Robert Spencer?
Robert Spencer, yeah.
Doesn't that make sense to you? I mean, you would try to find somebody that isn't so heated or so controversial because you're showing your cards right there.
Well, and to the listener, Cassy and I are not scholars, but we
research.
We do want to like be informed by like solid sources. Again, in the same article, the first piece on Islam, he cites Charlie Kirk, basically saying the same thing, and most of his sources kind of like back up what he's saying, and it just, I don't know, it just signifies to me that he's really working to prove a point, and rather than like find the research for it, and like let the road lead him where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't disagree with that.
I've been, and this kind of touches on your remarks earlier about just like white supremacy. I spend way too much time in the deep dark depths of and not as much as every journalist, but definitely enough for a local journalist
or people who study fashion.
Yeah, and I get an email newsletter from a guy named Andrew Torba, who is the founder of Gab.
Yeah, you introduced me to him.
Yeah, and he's lots of like civil rights groups have identified him and his organization as being like, advancing hateful ideologies. But he writes in ways that he's a better writer, but he writes things that really remind me of Travis Pardo's pieces. And for example, one of the recent newsletters is titled "The Choice You Cannot Avoid," and it advocates for the thesis of it is that every racial group, especially in the West and especially in the United States, organizes around the identity of their racial group, except for white people. And he has this like very like well developed victim complex that white people aren't allowed to organize around their own, around their identity, right? They're like if if there's such a thing as white culture, like it definitely like that has some like pretty gnarly echoes and historical, like, American Nazism and white supremacy. And his argument is that white people need to start organizing around their identity. And we're a couple of white folks, but it really struck me that that really echoes Travis's argument that we have to re-Christianize America. We have to like adhere to our British roots, and we have to establish English as the national language, and we have to cut off immigration from countries that are like not majority white. And that's just been something that's like been on my mind a lot. Just this overlap. So I think those like those kind of spidey senses that you had about like just like the white supremacist rhetoric in Pardo's pieces was pretty spot on.
Well, let's. I want to tease that out a little bit. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
So, okay, we British Anglo-Protestant people came across the sea to a land that wasn't ours, that was populated by people who did not look like us, okay, that had their own distinct culture. And we had as I'm identifying with them. And then these people who came across the sea also had their own culture. And, in history is not very pretty about what the white culture people did. And so if you really want to say that what white culture is, it's not very pretty. At least in the story of America, as far as like violence. That's really hard for me, because we are the ones, I feel as though if we're going to establish white people as a culture, and it's the only American culture, we need to understand that we pushed a lot of people out that were the original culture, including, ironically, Hispanics, because that was California and that was the western part of the United States, right?
Yeah, but I mean, by the time that what you could call Americans moved west, it was populated by it was the West was Mexico. It wasn't
right.
it wasn't the United States.
Yeah, so that's really troublesome to me, to kind of turn that over and to say that is. I'm not explaining it very well, but there's something off with that. So to me, it's like the American culture is it is about, we take what we think is ours.
White people came here, some 400 years ago, 600 years ago, and very like systematically displaced a like vibrant variety of cultures that were here, nations. What these folks would refer to as nations, like people of a common like culture and heritage.
And then tried to.
And we completely displaced them with ourselves. And now we have the United States of America, and we have immigration policies, and
we even used Native American culture, a part of Native American culture, as part of the foundation of our own laws, of our own the contracts of the Constitution. From what I understand, like that's part of the fabric of what the founding documents are too.
And yeah, I mean, like I think there were a lot of, and I'm not an expert on this, but I remember reading kind of I did a lot of reading in my 20s about, just like the founding of America, and we used their, democratic structures to cobble together some form of democracy. So we kind of extracted that from people who existed here. And there's a really interesting parallel in the cognitive dissonance there, right? Like, I think, we say that we're, or we don't, but like there's a faction of very conservative Americans who are ascendant in power right now, who say that we're under, like what they call an invasion. Whereas like history shows that we're actually the perpetrators of a very similar invasion. And the idea that, and like the Christian idea that like Christianity should take over the culture, and not allow Islam the same space in the public square.
It's to be honest, it's so arrogant. And like the idea, like you could totally say with immigration, a verse in the scripture, to whom much is given, much is required. The land, let's say the land was quote unquote sort of given to this culture of white Americans. I hate saying that. But if you're really thinking about Christian way of thinking, if that's the case, there's so much land, there's so much here, that why not? Why not open our borders? Not that I'm a proponent, I don't know what I'm a proponent of in that sense, but why not avail ourselves of helping people who are dirt poor, who it's unfathomable to me, the selfishness. It's unfathomable to me.
Well, and from a Christian perspective, like, and I'm an atheist, so I can't speak from that perspective.
But you probably know what a Christian perspective should be.
I grew up as a Christian, but I think like what is your view as a Christian? I think you just kind of articulated it, but like what's your read on like the biblical take on immigration and these issues of
well, I mean, everything should be done in order, law and order. I totally agree with that. But man, and I don't really think Christianity and politics, I just don't think religion and politics should be a syncretism. But I do think there's influences, and I do think people who are Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu, they have things within their faith that can serve beautiful purposes in the civic square. We are so arrogant to think that we're the only ones that have the answer. The other thing is, again, to whom much is given, much is required. The space that we have in our country to share is phenomenal. And the best resource as far as what my idea or what I think the Bible says is World Relief. Just go to World Relief. They are the ones that I think articulate the real Christian principle.
You've written about them, and I think we spoke about them your first time on the show. Can
I think you're right.
Tell me about that reporting. What is this alternative vision?
Well, that was World Relief. They just really believe that that helping the stranger is one of the biblical principles. You know, if you look at through the Old Testament to the New, it's love of stranger, love of caring for the widow, caring for the orphan, and you see it throughout even the theocracy of Israel in the Old Testament. So many strangers were welcomed into Israel. I mean, they left Egypt with Israel and joined the Israel Project, if you want to call it anything, and crossed the Red Sea with them. You know, I mean, there's so many rich layers to this understanding of what the stranger, who the stranger is, and it's really difficult to see a lot of Christians see this in a very selfish, my nation, my way. You know, it's just very difficult. And then to want to keep it that way. So anyway, I recommend you go to World Relief and see how they do it. Matthew Soren's is wonderful. He articulates the vision, I think, of what loving the stranger means.
And they specifically provide, like, the thing that they do is they provide resources to immigrant communities. And I think you had written a story that we republished at Range.
Yeah, it was about because the administration basically stopped all immigration, all funds, all of that right when he came into office. And so these organizations had to reconfigure how they were going to get money, how they were going to help, and a lot of these people that were here were on temporary visas, and that a lot of these temporary visas also were taken from them, and then they needed to be sent back home. So it's just, the staff had to go. There was just so many disruptions. So
like World Relief is part of a network of local, like, just like nonprofits that provide, and some of them are faith-based. And I think World Relief specifically is faith-based,
correct,
right?
It's Christian. IRC isn't. That's the, that's another one that's here locally.
And they, like, they have lost, like, a majority of their federal funding. That's
I think all of it.
Yeah. And so they've had to scramble and try to, like, dig up money from just, like, you know, from the couch cushions.
So they would receive the immigrant family at the airport, take them, set them up in an apartment, set them up with relief, you know, our tax money, which I would pay for
food, right?
Food,
yeah,
housing, clothes. Some of these families would come over. They would just have shopping bags worth of items, maybe one or two, come in the wintertime with flip-flops on from an African country. But the idea is we're saving them from harm.
Yeah. Well,
sorry, it's
thanks so much. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for those remarks, Cassy, and thanks for being here. We're about out of time this week, so I'm going to close this out. Free Range is a weekly news and public affairs program presented by Range Media and produced by Range Media and KYRS Community Radio, KYRS Medical Lake Spokane. Thank you so much, Cassy. This is our last live show of the year. You're going to hear some recordings from us in the next 2 shows. Until then, be safe, stay warm. Bye, everybody.